Hi, it's Patrick Vernon, here to talk about how venture capitalists do their jobs. In a previous video, we defined venture capital as institutional private equity investments in high-growth startups. Institutional refers to the institutions, the limited partners who supply the cash, to the VCs, the general partners, who make the investment decisions. It's a multifaceted job that includes fundraising, deal sourcing and investing, helping the portfolio grow, and ultimately exiting those startups and providing a return to our investors. I call this the VC job cycle, and today we'll focus on raising a fund. Everyone is aware that startups pitch to VCs for funding, but most are surprised to find out that VCs go on a very similar roadshow to pitch to their investors. Just as founders will pitch to lots of VCs and piece together a round, VCs also pitch to lots of LPs to piece together their fund. And just as founders pitch a specific amount of money they are raising and their strategy to hit milestones, VCs will pitch a specific amount of funding they are raising and their strategy to invest. The size of VC fund is a function of several variables, including the number of partners, the number of startups, and the average investment per startup. For example, let's say you have 2 partners, each planning to do 2 deals per year over a 5-year horizon. If each startup were to receive an average of $5 million, you would need to raise a $100 million fund. Note that this $5 million per startup refers to the entire life of the startup all the way to exit. Because the average per startup may need to be split over several rounds, the actual check size might be closer to 1/3 of the average allotted for each startup. So we're pitching our strategy to numerous limited partners. Once we receive enough commitments, we can close the fund, meaning it's closed to new LPs and ready to invest in startups. Closing the fund also starts a 10-year clock on our fund life. This is the window of time within which we've promised our LPs will return all their funding. The 10-year lifespan gives us significant constraints in our investing. We only have a handful of years to find new startups to give ourselves any chance to grow and exit before the 10 years are up. Once we find a new startup and are ready to invest, it's time for a capital call to get the funding from our LPs. When we raised our fund, each LP pledged a certain amount representing a percentage of the fund. When they receive our capital call for an investment in a new startup, our LPs are obligated to wire us their percentage. Back to our fund life of 10 years, if the general partners intend to stay in business for longer, we'll need to raise more funds. Specifically, we'll need a new fund in place by the end of the investment period of the first fund, or we won't be able to continue investing in new startups. This means fundraising for a new fund begins not long after closing a fund. A pattern that repeats itself so that you find VCs are always fundraising, always investing, always growing, and always exiting. So a successful VC firm will have multiple funds. Again, a firm is like a holding company with no time limit. Each fund is a separate legal entity with a 10-year lifespan and its own set of LPs and a separate portfolio. Another thing to note is funds tend to get bigger over time for a few reasons. Reason number 1 is because they can. A successful VC firm will have a track record that makes it much easier to raise new funds. The fee structure also creates incentives for bigger funds. Firms receive a management fee, typically in the 2% range, for managing the fund. These fees go toward salaries, rent, travel, and other operating expenses, and you can imagine you could do a lot more with an extra $8 million in your budget. But it is the carry, the splitting of the proceeds, where the VCs have the opportunity to make the most money. As we begin to collect proceeds from exits in our portfolio, we must first return 100% of the fund, meaning each LP gets all of their committed capital returned before any splitting of the proceeds. Let's look at an example with a $100 million fund. A typical success metric is to triple the fund, which would result in $300 million in proceeds. Taking out $100 million to return the fund to the LPs, we'd have $200 million to split. A 20% carry would result in $40 million to the GPs. Recall earlier when we looked at the variables involved in a fund size, and a $100 million fund could be 2 GPs doing 10 startups each at about $5 million per startup. Now let's say based on this success, our GPs want to raise a bigger fund too. Something in this algebra is going to have to give. We'll either need to recruit a third partner, add one deal per year to each partner's workload, or put more into each startup. That new strategy, along with our track record, is what we'll be pitching to new LPs as we continue along the VC job cycle. We've scratched the surface of these topics here in this video. If you'd like to delve more deeply, I encourage you to check out my book, VC Strategy: How to Think Like a Venture Capitalist, at vcraiser.com.